My name is Holt Mercer, and the part of this you will not believe is the part I lived through twice. I have been a courier and salvage pilot for 31 years. I have crossed the spindle 411 times. I have buried 2 crewmates with my own hands, 1 wife by proxy, and a brother I never met in person because the war took him before the paperwork cleared. None of that prepared me for the 43 minutes that I am about to set down. I am writing this because the Mercantile Board asked me to write it, and because I am old enough now that the rest of my crew is dead, and because if I do not put it on paper somebody will tell it wrong after I am gone. So here it is. Plain. The way it happened. We had come out of the spindle with a hold full of contraband insulin and a port-side thruster that sounded like a man choking on a fish bone. The ship was the Lark. She was 28 meters of welded scrap with a name too pretty for her, and I had owned her outright for 19 years. My co-pilot was a woman named Jin Sevra. My engineer was a kid called Bode who had been with me 8 months and would not see 9. We had a route that was supposed to drop us inside a salvage exclusion zone called the Long Hush, where the stars were old and the patrols were lazy. And from there, it was 3 quiet days to a buyer who would not ask questions. The Long Hush was not quiet. The Vael had been waiting for us. I had seen Vael ships twice in my life before that night, both times at distance, both times running. Up close they were worse than the stories. They did not come at you. They folded toward you. Their hulls were dark and ribbed, and they moved like something that had grown into the shape of a ship rather than been built into it. I have looked at a lot of ships in my life. Most ships, even the ugly ones, look like they were drawn on paper first. Vael ships do not look drawn. They look hatched. The first hit came across our nose without any kind of warning. No hail, no challenge, no transponder ping. 1 second we were drifting between 2 cold stars on a course I had flown 96 times in my life. The next second there was a line of white across the front of the Lark that turned, in slow motion, into a tear, and the tear ran from the nose of the ship down the starboard flank and stopped at the second bulkhead after the cockpit, which was the bulkhead Bode was on the other side of. I felt the pull of the breech in my ears before I heard it in the hull. The Lark shrieked. I had never heard her shriek before. I had heard her groan and complain and make the small dry rattles that ships of her age make when they are tired, but I had not heard her shriek, and I would not hear her shriek again until much later that night. I heard Bode die through the intercom. He did not scream. He just said, "Oh," in a small, surprised voice, the way you say it when you have spilled something. Then the line went flat. He had been 23 years old. He had a girl on Havre Station he wrote to every week, longhand on paper, because his mother had told him a letter on paper was the only kind that proved you had thought about a person. I had read one of his letters once by accident when it had fallen out of his locker, and I had put it back without finishing it, because some things are not yours to read. He had been with me 8 months. He had been getting good. He would not get good now. Jin got us under the lip of a derelict cruise hulk that had been drifting in the hush since before either of us was born. The Lark fit into the cruise hulk's broken belly, the way a hand fits into a half-closed fist. The Vael lost us for 13 seconds. In those 13 seconds, Jin got the reactor down to a whisper, and I killed every active emitter on the ship, and we sat there in the cold dark and listened to our own breathing. They did not lose us. They were just being patient. I watched on the passive scope as one of the Vael ships unfolded itself across the cruise hulk's spine, methodical, taking the wreck apart 1 section at a time, working its way down toward us. The other Vael ship was somewhere I could not see, which was worse than seeing it. Jin looked at me across the cockpit and did not say anything. She did not need to. We had been together long enough that I knew the look. It meant, "We are not getting out of this one, Holt." It meant, "Tell me what you want to do." What I wanted to do was something stupid. I had a thing in the Lark's belly that I had carried unused for 14 years. A relic. A small black cylinder no longer than my forearm, sold to me by a trade guild widow whose husband had stolen it off a council survey wreck and never lived long enough to fence it. She had called it a slip drive. She had told me it could fold a ship sideways through a short stretch of time, and put it somewhere it had been a few minutes earlier or a few minutes later, and she had told me not to use it unless I was already dead. I had paid her in real money because her husband had been a friend of mine, and because she had 3 children and no income, and I had bolted the cylinder into the Lark's auxiliary mount and never touched it again. I did not believe in it. I believed in the widow, and the widow had been honest, but I did not believe a forearm-sized cylinder could fold a ship through time. Nothing that small had any business doing anything that large. I told Jin about it. I had never told her about it before. I am ashamed to say that. She listened the way she always listened, head tilted, eyes hard, and when I was done she said, "All right." She said, "Then we do that." She said it like I had just told her the weather. I primed the cylinder. Jin tied the Lark's nav into the auxiliary mount. Outside, the Vael ship that I could see had reached the section of the crew's hulk 1 bulkhead above us, and I could hear, through the hull, the small, careful sound of something cutting metal that did not want to be cut. We had maybe 40 seconds. I pulled the cylinder's trigger. I cannot tell you what it felt like. I have tried. The closest I have come is this. Imagine you are standing in a room, and the room is a photograph, and somebody folds the photograph in half and then unfolds it, and you are still in the room, but the room is now a slightly different room. Nothing in my body moved. Everything in my body had moved a moment ago, and would move a moment from now, but right then nothing was moving. And I was looking at a console that was the Lark's console, but was also not. And Jin was beside me, and was also not. Then the Lark made a sound I had never heard her make. A long groan, the way a building groans before it settles. The lights stuttered. The console threw an error I did not recognize, a string of glyphs that were not in any language I knew. Jin said my name. She said it twice. I turned to her and she was looking past me at the door of the cockpit, and the door of the cockpit was open, and somebody who was not Jin and was not me and should not have been on the Lark at all was standing in the doorway. He was a man in his early 30s. He was wearing a coat I had owned 26 years ago and lost in a card game on Havre Station. He had my jaw. He had my hands. He had the small white scar over his right eyebrow where a piece of debris had clipped me on my first solo run when I was 22. He was thinner than I had been at that age somehow, and his hair was a color I had forgotten my hair had ever been. He looked at me, and his face went through 3 expressions in about a half-second, none of which I will try to name, and then he said, in a voice I had not heard in 30 years because it was my own voice from when I had been young, he said, "Who the hell are you, and what are you doing on my ship?" I want to be careful here. I want to be precise, because this is the part that the people who debriefed me kept circling back to, and because this is the part I have spent the rest of my life trying to understand. The Lark was my ship. It had been my ship for 19 years on my side of that doorway. On his side of that doorway, it had been his ship for less than a year. He had bought her off a junk dealer in the same port my older self would later use to sell her. She was, in his time, the cleanest she had ever been in her life. I knew that because I remembered her being that clean. I remembered standing in that doorway, in that coat, at his age, and I remembered the morning I had bolted the slip-drive cylinder into her belly with my own young hands. What I had done, what the widow's relic had done, was fold the Lark sideways into a moment from her own past. Not my past, her past. The cylinder did not move ships through time. It moved them through their own history. It found a moment when the Lark had been somewhere safe and folded the present Lark over the past Lark like one playing card laid on top of another. 2 ships in one hull, 2 crews in one cockpit, 2 of me. Jin was the first to understand it. Jin had always been quick. She looked at the younger man in the doorway and she looked at me and she said, "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." Then she said, "Holt, that's you." Then she said, "Holt, that is actually you." And then she laughed once, a hard, short laugh, and the younger man flinched at the laugh because he did not know her, because in his time he had not met her yet, because I would not meet her for another 9 years and would not crew with her for another 12. The younger me looked at the older me. The older me looked at the younger me. The Lark groaned again. The console kept throwing those glyphs I did not recognize. Outside in my time, the Vael were a bulkhead away. Outside in his time, the Lark had been moored in a dry dock in a port called Brel on a Tuesday morning, and he had been making coffee. I will tell you what he said first, because what he said first is important. He did not say what is happening. He did not say who are you. He did not say is this real. He said you broke the auxiliary mount, didn't you? You overcharged the cylinder. You damn fool, I told you not to overcharge the cylinder. I had not told myself anything. The widow had told me. I had not even told Jin until that night what the cylinder was. But the younger man was talking like he had had this conversation already, like he was finishing a sentence I had not started. And then I understood. The folding works both ways. He was not just my past. I was not just his future. Both of us were in both moments, and what either of us did, the other one had already done, and what either of us remembered, the other one was about to live. It was not a meeting. It was a loop. The loop had been closed before either of us walked into it. I almost lost my nerve right there. I want you to understand that. I have been in firefights, and I have been in collapsing pressure hulls, and I have once spent 4 days in a survival pod waiting for a rescue that was not coming, and none of those things frightened me the way the loop frightened me. Because in the loop you cannot lie to yourself. You are sitting across from yourself. You can see what you used to be. You can see what you have become. And in between is every decision you wish you had made differently, every person you wish you had been kinder to, every regret you have learned to live with by not nomming. And now you have to look another version of yourself in the eye and pretend you do not see those things in him because he has not done them yet. The younger me, I remember, was looking at my hands, at the liver spots on the backs of them, at the way the knuckles had thickened, at the small permanent tremor in the left index finger that I had picked up after a bad landing in my 50s. He was looking at his future like a man reading a receipt for something he did not remember buying. Jin said, Holt, listen. She had her hand on my shoulder and she was pointing past the younger me, past the open door of the cockpit, into the corridor of the Lark, and at the end of the corridor where the airlock used to be, the hull was not the hull anymore. It was a thinness, a wrongness. You could see through it the way you can see through old water. On the other side of the thinness I could see stars I did not recognize, and below the stars, very small, very far, the curve of a green world. The Lark had folded so hard into her own past that her body could not decide what time she was in, and the parts of her that could not decide were starting to come apart. The younger me saw it too. His face went the color of paper. He said, Belgium. Then he said, sorry, that's what my granddad used to say when something was bad. He said it more to himself than to me. He said, this is going to rip a hole the size of Belgium in the side of the universe, isn't it? I said, son, it is going to rip a hole bigger than that. He flinched when I called him son. I had not meant to. It had come out before I could stop it. He flinched, and then his jaw set, and I knew the jaw setting because I had set my jaw that way 10,000 times in my life, and I felt with a sudden clean sharp shock what it was that he was about to do. He was going to fix it. He was going to fix it because he was 31 years old and he believed he could fix anything, because he had not yet learned the things that I had learned, because he had not yet stood at the rail of a hospital bed and watched his wife stop breathing, because he had not yet sat in a survival pod for 4 days, because he had not yet had to bury Bode in the cold of a borrowed cruise hulk while a Vael ship cut through the ceiling. He was going to fix it because the world had not yet taught him that some things do not get fixed, and he was going to be right. That is the part the Vael did not understand. I am getting ahead of myself, but I want you to hold that thought, because the Vael did not understand it then, and they do not understand it now, and they will not understand it ever. They saw 2 versions of the same man in the same room, and they assumed that was a weakness. They assumed that 2 of a thing is more confused than 1. They assumed wrong. The younger me went to the console. Not my console. His console. The console as it had been when the Lark was a year old, before I had rewired it 3 times and patched the nav panel with a piece of an old vending machine, and labeled the temperamental switches in a handwriting that had gotten worse every decade. He moved through the console like a man who knew where everything was, because in his time, everything was where it was supposed to be, and I stood behind him and watched my own younger hands move over controls I had forgotten existed. He said the cylinder is not the problem. The cylinder did what it was supposed to do. The problem is your nav. He said your nav like it was somebody else's nav, not his nav, because in the loop my nav was not the same as his nav even though it was the same panel. He said, you tied the auxiliary into the primary loop. You shouldn't have done that. Your broadcasting position across both timelines. I said I had 40 seconds. I tied it into what I could. He said, I know, I remember. He said it the way you say a thing you have known your whole life. He said it like a man finishing his own sentence. And I felt the loop tighten around us both, because of course he remembered. He remembered because he was about to live it. He remembered because, in 19 years, he would be me, standing in that cockpit, trying to remember what to do, and he would remember because his younger self was about to show him. I do not know how to make this clearer than that. The mercantile board kept asking me to make it clearer. I do not think it can be made clearer. It is a thing you understand once you have stood inside it and never quite get out of. While he worked on the nav, I went to the cockpit window and looked at the thinness in the hull. The green world on the other side of it was closer now, or we were closer to it. I could see whether on its surface white spirals of cloud over an ocean that was not blue but a kind of dark teal. The thinness was spreading. The corridor floor where Jin had been standing a minute ago was now a kind of half floor, real where her boots were planted, but going translucent toward the edges. Jin was looking down at her own feet with an expression I have never seen on her face before or since. She said, "Hold, I don't want to fall through my own ship." I said, "You won't." She said, "You don't know that." I said, "I know it because I remember it." I said it without thinking. And the moment I said it, I understood that I did remember it. I remembered, somewhere in the back of my mind, a moment from my younger life that I had filed away as a dream. I had been 29. I had been on the Lark, alone in dry dock in Brel. I had been making coffee. And for a fraction of a second the corridor had gone strange, and I had seen, very briefly, a man who looked like my father, and a dark-haired woman I did not recognize, and I had heard the older man say, "You won't." And I had blinked and the corridor had been normal again, and I had drunk my coffee and forgotten about it until that exact moment, 19 years later, when I said the same words to Jin in the same corridor, and felt the loop close around the memory like a hand closing around a coin. She must have seen the look on my face, because she said, "What?" I said nothing. I did not have the words for it. I do not have the words for it now. I had just remembered the future, or I had just remembered the past remembering the future, or there was no difference between those two things. The loop did not care which way you walked around it. The younger me at the console said, "All right." He said, "I can reroute," he said. "But I need you to hold the auxiliary feed steady." He said, "You, the older one, you go back to the engine deck. There's a manual valve on the starboard cooling line. You'll have to hold it open by hand because the actuator is going to fail. I know it's going to fail because, well." He did not finish. He did not need to. I said, "How long?" He said, 4 minutes, maybe 5. I said, "The Vael will be through the hull in 3. He said, "No, they won't." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because you remember they didn't." I have thought about that sentence every day of my life since. Every single day. I would like you to understand what it is like to have the man you used to be tell you calmly that the reason you will survive the next 4 minutes is that you, the older version, are already remembering having survived them. I would like you to understand that the only thing holding the loop together at that moment was my own stubborn refusal to let go of who I had been. Because if I had stopped believing him, if I had stopped believing me, the loop would have come apart. The thinness in the hull would have swallowed us. The Vael would have come through. The Lark would have died, and both of us would have died with her, and the hole in the side of the universe would have done whatever a hole in the side of the universe does. I went to the engine deck. I had not been on the engine deck of the young Lark in 30 years. It smelled different. It smelled new. The decking under my boots was a shade of dark green I had forgotten she had ever been painted. There was a coffee ring on the top of the auxiliary panel, fresh, still wet around the edges, the way coffee leaves a ring when you set a cup down for less than a minute and then pick it up again. He had been making coffee when I had arrived. He had set the cup down on the auxiliary panel. He had been gone from this deck for maybe 90 seconds when I came down the ladder, and 90 seconds was not enough time for the ring to dry. I stood there for a moment just looking at the ring of coffee. I am not a sentimental man. I do not say I am not a sentimental man to brag about it. I say it because it is the truth, and because the truth matters here. I am not sentimental, and I stood there and looked at a coffee ring on a panel for what was probably 4 or 5 seconds longer than I had to, and I felt something in my throat that I have not been able to name in 30 years. I found the starboard cooling line. I found the manual valve. It was a small brass thing the size of my fist, exactly where the younger me had said it would be, exactly where I remembered putting my hand on it sometime in my 20s because the actuator had failed, and I had had to hold it open by hand for 4 minutes while sweat ran down my face, and a song I half remembered played on the radio that someone had left on. The song was playing on the radio. I had not turned the radio on. The radio had been on in his time on a Tuesday morning in Brel because he had liked to listen to music while he made coffee. The radio was still on. The song was the same song I had half remembered for 30 years. It was a slow song with a woman singing it, a woman with a voice like an old cigarette, and I had spent 30 years trying to find that song again and never finding it because I did not know any of the words and I did not know the name of the singer. And I had told myself it was probably an old broadcast I had picked up on a sleepless night somewhere and dreamed into something. Now I knew. Now I knew it had been a Tuesday morning in Brel. I put my hand on the valve. I held it open. Somewhere above me, on the bridge, my younger self was working on the nav. Somewhere above him, on the upper deck, Jin was watching the thinness in the hull. Somewhere outside the Lark, in my time, the Vael were a bulkhead away and closing. Somewhere outside the Lark in his time, it was a Tuesday morning in a port called Brel, and the only thing that was wrong with the world was that an older version of himself had appeared in his cockpit and called him son. The valve burned my palm. The cooling fluid was meant to be cold, and instead it was hot, the way cooling fluid goes hot in the second before a coolant failure, and I felt the metal heat under my hand and I did not let go, and I thought, very clearly, the way you think when you are alone with a piece of metal and a problem. This is what I have been for. This is what all of it has been for. Every bad landing, every dead friend, every decade of holding on to a ship I should have sold, every grief I had not put down because I did not know how. All of it had been getting me ready to stand on the engine deck of a younger version of my own ship and hold a brass valve open with a hand that knew the shape of the valve because the hand had held it before. A man does not often get to look at his own life from a distance and see what it added up to. Most of us never do. We spend our years stacking small days on top of small days, and we tell ourselves the stack is going somewhere. And most of the time the stack is not going anywhere. The stack is just a stack. But there are nights when the stack turns out to have been a staircase, and you find yourself standing at the top of it with your hand on a piece of brass, and you understand with no pride and no surprise that every step you climbed got you here. That was the kind of night I was having. I had not asked for it. I would not have asked for it. But it was the night I had, and I was the man I was, and the valve was open under my hand. I counted my breaths. I had learned to count my breaths a long time ago, from an old freight captain who had told me that fear is a thing that arrives on its own schedule and leaves on yours. I counted to 40. I counted to 80. The cooling line shuddered. The brass under my palm sang a small steady note that I could feel in the bones of my arm. Somewhere above me, the younger Holt Mercer was at a console that he thought of as new, working through a reroute I would not have known how to do. Because at 31 he had still believed. He understood the Lark all the way down, and at 80 he was right. The Vael came through the hull at 3 minutes and 11 seconds. I want you to picture them. I have been asked to describe them more times than I can count, and I am told I do not describe them well, but I will try. They were taller than men, but only by a head. Their bodies were ridged and dark, and the ridges were not armor but something more like the rings of a tree. They moved on 4 limbs and stood on 2, and when they stood on 2 they were wrong, because the joints did not bend where joints are supposed to bend, and they did not have faces the way we have faces. They had a kind of cluster of dark optics in the front of their heads, and a slit below the optics that opened sideways instead of up and down, and when they spoke, it was not with sound, exactly. It was with a pressure in the air that you felt in the bones of your jaw before you understood it as language. They came through the hull at 3 minutes and 11 seconds, into the Lark of my time, 2 of them, the way the Vael always came when they thought a thing was finished. They came into the cargo hold first. I felt them before I saw them. I felt the pressure in my jaw. I felt the wrongness in the air. And I knew, with the absolute calm certainty of a man who is holding a valve open and cannot move, that I was about to be the first part of the Lark that they found. But Jin was on the upper deck. Jin was on the upper deck with a cutter rifle and a temper, and Jin had also remembered in her own way that this story was going to work, because Jin had heard me say to her, "You won't," and she had decided to believe me. And belief, when Jin Sevra chose to give it, was a weapon. She came down the ladder behind the Vael without waiting. She did not call out. She did not warn me. She put 2 shots into the back of the lead Vael's head before either of them registered her, and the second Vael turned, and she put a shot into the slit below its optics, and the slit closed around the shot like a mouth closing around a finger, and the Vael folded down onto the decking and did not get up. The lead Vael was not dead. The lead Vael was hurt, and the lead Vael was angry, and the lead Vael turned toward me, because I was the closest moving thing it could see, and I was still holding the valve, and I could not let go. It is at this point in the story that the board kept asking me what I was thinking. I have told them the truth. I was not thinking anything. There was no thought. There was only the brass of the valve under my palm and the song on the radio and the heat coming up the cooling line and the certainty, which was not a thought but was older than a thought, that I was going to hold the valve open, because in 19 years, a young man on a bridge above me would need me to have held it. The Vael reached for me. The younger me shot it. I had not heard him come down the corridor. I had not known he was armed. He had come down the corridor from the bridge with a slug pistol he had bought used on Havers Station in his first year on the Lark. A pistol I had not fired in 20 years because I had stopped carrying it after Bo joined the crew. A pistol that I had been about to sell the week we ran the long hush. He shot the Vael in the throat from 2 meters away, and the Vael went down, and the younger me looked at me over the body of it and said, "You're going to keep that pistol. You're going to want to remember why." I said, "I will." He said, "Hold the valve." I said, "I am." Above us, on the bridge, the nav rerouted. I felt it through the deck. The Lark made a sound that was not a groan this time, but something like a sigh, and the thinness in the hull began to thicken back into hull, and the green world on the other side of the thinness shrank and went dark, and the song on the radio cut off mid-verse the way songs cut off when somebody changes the station. The loop began to open. I had not thought about what opening the loop would mean until it began to happen. I had been so focused on the Vael and on the valve, and on the younger man who was me, that I had not thought about the obvious thing, which was that when this ended, he would go back to his Tuesday morning in Brel. He would go back to a year I had already lived. He would go back to the version of his life in which he had not yet met Jin, in which he had not yet lost Bode, in which he had not yet buried his wife, in which he had not yet become the man I had become. And he would forget. I knew he would forget because I had forgotten. I had remembered a dream once of a man who looked like my father in the corridor of the Lark, and a dark-haired woman, and a sentence I could not place. I had not remembered the rest. I had not remembered the veil, or the valve, or the song, or the older voice that called me son. The loop, when it opened, was going to take all of that out of his head and leave him with a fragment, the way the loop had once taken it out of mine. The younger me must have seen it on my face. He was sharper than I gave him credit for. He looked at me in the corridor with the dead veil between us, and he said, "What am I going to forget?" I said, "Most of it." He said, "All of it." I said, "No, you'll keep a piece. You won't know what it is. You'll think it was a dream." He stood there. He had a slug pistol in one hand and a streak of Vael blood on the cuff of a coat I had owned 26 years ago, and he looked, in that moment, very much like a man who had just done something hard and had not yet figured out that he had done it. I knew the look because I had spent a long time in front of mirrors learning not to wear it. He said, "Will I remember her?" He meant Jin. I looked at him. He was a young man who had just met a woman who, in his time, did not yet exist in his life. He had not had time to know her. He had not had time to love her. He had had time to watch her save him from a thing that should have killed him, and that had been enough for whatever piece of him was asking. I said, "You'll meet her. You'll meet her in 9 years. She'll be working a freight desk on a station you've never heard of, and she'll be rude to you the first time you talk to her, and you'll never tell her that you remember her face from before you met her because you won't remember it on purpose. You'll just feel when you see her that you know her, and you'll be right." He nodded. He did not say anything. He looked at the corridor, at the dead veil, at the brass burn already forming on my palm, at the small white scar over his own eyebrow that I no longer had because mine had faded with the decades. He looked like a man who was running through everything he wanted to ask and was choosing, with effort, not to ask any of it, because he knew that whatever I told him he was not going to get to keep. He said one thing. I said yes. He said, "Am I a good man?" I had thought for 30 years that he had not asked me that question. I had told myself for 30 years that he had not asked me that question, because it would have been an unbearable question to be asked by the man you used to be. But he asked it. He asked it standing in the corridor of his own younger ship with a slug pistol in his hand and the body of a Vael at his feet. And he asked it because he was 31 years old, and the world had not yet told him what he was, and he wanted, the way a young man wants, to know. I said, "You're going to lose people. You're going to lose more of them than is fair. You're going to make some bad calls. You're going to make 1 or 2 calls that will keep you up at night for the rest of your life. But yes, you're a good man. You stay a good man. You hold the valve." He looked at me a long time. Then he nodded once, the small hard nod of a man accepting a contract. He turned and went back up the corridor toward the bridge, and I watched him go. And as he went, he started to fade, the way you fade out of a photograph that is being unfolded. By the time he reached the ladder to the upper deck, he was half there. By the time he reached the bridge, he was gone. The valve cooled under my hand. I let go. My palm came away with the brass shape of the valve burned into it in a half-moon I still have, 30 years later, the way some men still have the scars of the wars they fought when they were young. I went up to the bridge. Jin was at the console. The console was my console again. The handwriting on the temperamental switches was my handwriting again, the bad handwriting of my 60s, not the clean handwriting of my 30s. The Lark was the Lark I knew. Outside, in the crew's hulk's belly, the wreckage of 2 Vael was on the cargo deck, and a 3rd Vael ship was still somewhere out there in the long hush. But the Lark's emitters were off, and her reactor was at a whisper, and the 3rd ship had not yet found us. Jin said, "Did that happen?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Was that you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I don't know." She let me sit with that for a while. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. She went and made me a cup of something hot, and she put it in my hand, and the brass burn on my palm hurt against the cup, and the pain of it was the first thing in the last hour that had felt like the right kind of pain, the ordinary kind, the kind a man can hold. I sat in the pilot's seat. I looked out at the cruise hulk's broken belly. I thought about my younger self in his coat that I had lost in a card game. I thought about the song on the radio in Braille. I thought about how, somewhere on the other side of the loop, a 31-year-old version of me was, right then, blinking in the cockpit of a clean Lark in a dry dock on a Tuesday morning, holding a cup of coffee, looking around at the corridor and wondering why he felt like someone had been there a moment ago and what the half-memory of an older voice was, the voice that had said you won't, and why it would not let him go. He would forget most of it inside a day. He would forget all of it inside a week, except for the fragment about the woman, the dark-haired woman, and that would sit in him for 9 years until he met Jen Sevra at a freight desk and felt that he knew her face. He would never put it together. He would not put it together because the loop did not let him. I am the only one who knows. I am the only one on either side of the loop who knows. He lived it and forgot it. I lived it and remember every breath of it. The loop is closed and it is mine to carry. We got out of the long hush 3 hours later. The third Vael ship came looking for the first two. By the time it found the wreckage on the cargo deck of the cruise hulk, we were 600,000 kilometers away and accelerating, and we made it to the buyer with the insulin and we got paid, and we put Bode's name on the cargo log next to the column for crew lost on this run, the way the regulations required us to do. The buyer offered me a drink and I drank it. Jin offered me another and I drank that one too. I have spent most of my life since then trying to drink the loop quiet, and most nights it works. Some nights it does not. I have been asked, more times than I can stand, why the Vael lost. They had us. They had us cold. They had 2 ships in a wreck field and a crippled freighter and a dead engineer and a hold full of contraband and a captain who had run out of ideas. They had every advantage that can be measured. They had us by every number that can be put in a column. And they lost. I have thought about this a great deal. I have thought about it because the board wanted me to, and because the council debriefers wanted me to, and because the Vael themselves, on the rare occasions when a human gets the chance to ask them a question in live, refuse to answer it. I have thought about it because I want to know. This is what I think. The Vael see time the way we see a road. They see it laid out point to point, and they make their plans by walking up and down it and seeing where every step leads. They had walked up and down the long hush that night. They had seen the Lark come in. They had seen Bode die. They had seen the cruise hulk close around us. They had seen us in their forecast, sitting in our hidden ship waiting to be cut out of the belly of the wreck like meat from a shell. And in that forecast, in their walking up and down of the road, there was nothing that suggested 2 of us. There was nothing that suggested a loop. There was nothing that suggested a man old enough to be my father standing on an engine deck, holding a brass valve open by hand because his 31-year-old self, 26 years in the past, was going to need him too. The Vael's forecast does not allow for memory. Memory is the human thing they cannot model. Memory, the real kind, the kind that runs both ways, the kind a man uses to hold himself together when the world is trying to come apart, is a thing they do not have words for. They saw 2 of me and thought the second was a duplicate. It was not a duplicate. It was a younger man whose older self was going to remember being him so hard that the loop would close around the both of them and crush them into one moving shape that the Vael's forecast could not see. We did not beat them with a better ship. We did not beat them with a bigger gun. We beat them because a man who has lived a long time can, if he tries hard enough, reach back and put his hand on the shoulder of the man he used to be. And that man, if he is the right kind of man, will reach forward and do the same. The Vael cannot do this. I do not believe any species can do this except ours. I have asked. I have looked. I have not found one. I am told, by people who study these things, that what we did that night should not have worked. I am told the slip drive was meant for short jumps, minutes at most, not for folding a ship across her own decades. I am told that the loop should have collapsed the moment my younger self looked at my hands and saw the liver spots. I am told that what kept it together was something the experts cannot quite name, and that they have settled on calling it in their reports a coherence anomaly. I have read the reports. The reports are very long and they say nothing. I will tell you what kept it together. I kept it together. He kept it together. We kept it together because we were the same stubborn man at two different points in his life, and neither of us was going to be the one who broke the chain. I have thought about chains a great deal since that night. I have thought about how a chain is not a single thing, the way a rope is a single thing, but is instead a long series of small agreements between paired links, each link agreeing to hold the weight of every link that comes after it. A chain is not strong because the iron is strong. A chain is strong because every link, every single one, has decided that it will not be the one that breaks. There is no link in a chain that is more important than any other link. The whole chain is the work of every link doing its job, and a man, I have come to think, is a kind of chain. He is the boy he was at 6, holding on to the boy he was at 12, holding on to the man he was at 30, holding on to the man he is at 80. Each link in the chain has to decide it will not be the one that breaks. The Vael, I think, do not have that chain. They do not have those links. They are whatever they are at the moment they are it, and there is no holding back through the years. That is why they could not see the loop. The loop ran the length of my chain. I was holding on to a younger link, and a younger link was holding on to me, and the Vael walked up to the chain and could not see it because the chain was made of years and the Vael only had hours. Jin died 11 years after that night, not in a fight. In a hospital bed, slow, the way the unlucky ones go. I held her hand at the end. She did not say anything in her last hour, but at one point she looked at me and her eyes were clear, and she squeezed my fingers once, and I knew what the squeeze meant because we had been together long enough that I always knew what the squeezes meant. The squeeze meant, I remember. I remember, too. The years between the long hush and Jin's hospital bed were good years. I want that on the record. The mercantile board took my testimony, and the council debriefers took my testimony, and the people who write the long reports about coherence anomalies took my testimony, and none of them ever asked me about the years in between, and the years in between were the good years of my life. Jin and I ran the Lark together. We took clean runs and a few dirty ones, and most of them we got paid for. We took on a new engineer, a quiet man from a quiet world, and he stayed with us 4 years and then went home to marry a woman his mother had picked out, and we sent him a wedding gift and never saw him again. We took on another engineer after that, and another. We buried 2 of them. We saw the rest off into other lives. Jin and I never married. We did not need to. The Lark was the ring on our finger, and the run was the vow, and the years went where the years go. I sold the Lark 7 years after Jin died. I sold her to a young woman with a hard mouth and steady hands who reminded me a little of Jin at that age. I did not tell her about the slip drive cylinder in the auxiliary mount. I unbolted the cylinder the night before the sale, and I took it out into the dark of the dock, and I dropped it into a recycler and watched the recycler take it apart. I do not know if that was the right thing to do. I think it was. The loop is closed. The widow is dead. Her children are grown. The cylinder did the one job it was made to do, the night in the long hush, and there was no other job it needed to do, and I did not want it to fall into the hands of a younger man who would not understand it. I am 81 years old. I have a small place on a quiet world with a window that looks out at a sea that is not blue but a kind of dark teal, the same color as the world I saw through the thinness in the Lark's hull when the loop was open. I do not know if that is a coincidence. I do not think anything is a coincidence anymore. Some nights when the air is right and the wind is right, I sit on the porch with a glass of something warm and I think about the brass valve on the engine deck of a younger Lark, and the song on the radio in Brel, and the small white scar over my own 31-year-old eyebrow. I think about a Vael, dying on the corridor floor with a slug from a pistol I would later carry for 20 years. I think about Jin, coming down the ladder behind it, 2 shots in the back of its head, no warning, no waste. I think about Bode, who never knew the loop, who died saying oh in a small surprised voice. And I think about the young man in my coat, the one I used to be, standing in the cockpit of a clean Lark on a Tuesday morning in Brel, blinking in the daylight, holding a cup of coffee, looking around at a corridor that seemed for a moment to have had someone in it. I think about him not knowing that the someone was me. I think about him going on with his Tuesday and his Wednesday and the next 9 years and meeting Jin at a freight desk and feeling that he knew her face and not knowing why. I do not envy him. He had not lost his wife yet. He had not lost Bode yet. He had not lost Jin yet. But he had also not been the man on the engine deck. He had not held the valve. He had not stood in the corridor and shot a Vael off the back of an older version of himself and said, "You're going to keep that pistol. You're going to want to remember why." I kept the pistol. I have it in a drawer beside my bed. I have not fired it in 30 years. I do not need to. It is not in the drawer to be fired. It is in the drawer because, somewhere on the far side of a loop that closed 30 years ago, a younger man told an older man to keep it, and the older man said I will, and a man's word to himself is the only contract that does not run out. That is the story of what happened in the long hush. That is what the Vael cannot model. That is what we have that they do not, and that is why in the end when the road runs out and the forecast says we are done, we will not be done. We will reach back. We will reach forward. We will hold the valve. Hold the valve. That is the part I want you to remember. If you remember anything at all of what an old man wrote down because the board asked him to, hold the valve. Hold it until the man you used to be can finish the job. Hold it until the man you will become arrives to take it from you. Hold it because nobody else is going to. Hold it because you said you would, even if the only one you said it to was yourself. I have held mine. I am going to put down the pen now. The light on the porch is going, and the sea is the color it has always been, and somewhere in a port called Brel, on a Tuesday morning a long time ago, a young man is making coffee and feeling, for no reason he can name, that he is not alone in his ship. He is not alone in his ship. He never was.